Hello, hope you guys are doing all right. I just want to take today to review a lot of the general characteristics of feudalism that you've been reading about and doing stuff with over the past couple of weeks. To start with, when I'm talking about feudalism, we're talking about the socio-political structure of medieval Europe, or rather, the way that European politics and society was structured and set up during the Middle Ages. And the defining characteristic of feudalism during this period was its heavy emphasis on social classes, where your social class would effectively determine your rank and your role in society, and by extension, what your lifestyle would be like, what rights you had, what privileges you had, and ultimately how much opportunity you had. So, social class was a really big deal during this time period. And these social classes were determined by birth. So, whichever one you were born into, you were stuck. There was no way to move up. If you were born a peasant, you were going to stay a peasant. You could not move up from being a peasant. So, that's what historians describe as having no social mobility. You can't change your social class. Whatever you're born in, you're stuck as. And if we're looking at what the different social classes are, at the very bottom of medieval society, you had peasants. And peasants were by far the largest group. Over 90% of the population during this time period were peasants. Right above peasants, you had knights, or lower-ranking members of the nobility. So nobles who had really small fiefs or small plots of land that they owned. And these nobles were generally sworn as vassals or sworn to loyalty to higher ranking nobles. So above knights and lower nobles, you had upper ranking nobles who owned larger plots of land. And many of them had lower ranking nobles sworn as vassals to them. And then above the nobles, you had the royalty, or the king, who was technically had power over everything in his kingdom. Another important group to consider during this period is the clergy, or the church. Church officials played a pretty significant role, but they notably don't really fit neatly into the social hierarchy. The church really kind of played by its own rules. The church had its own hierarchy of positions, and the church was kind of off to the side of the more rigid social structure. And the church had a lot of influence on these different classes, but at the same time, they weren't directly involved and didn't have direct authority or power over anybody. So if we're going to look at how these classes relate to each other, there are two general interactions, or two main functions of feudalism regarding how it worked. First, peasants worked nobles' lands in exchange for protection. That's the base relationship, or the base function of feudalism. So if you remember, after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the Roman military was no longer around to protect people from the pretty rampant and frequent attacks and invasions by Germanic tribes or the Germanic barbarians. So in the absence of a central military force, people were forced to turn to nobles or wealthy landowners for protection. Wealthy people who could afford and had the resources to arm and equip and train their own private security forces. And in exchange for receiving protection and being allowed to live on this noble's land, the peasant would work for them and give the noble a large portion of what they made or what they grew on their land. And as a peasant as well, peasants did not have equal rights. Peasants were also forced to give up some of their rights and privileges as well in exchange for the privilege of being able to live on the noble's land and receive protection. Just some examples of limited rights of peasants. Peasants were not allowed to get married without their lord's consent. Peasants were not allowed to leave their lord's estate without his consent or without his permission. So a lot of pretty major events or major things that a peasant would want to do with their life would require permission or an okay from whoever's land they were living on. At the higher end of the social pyramid, kings would give nobles land and title in exchange for loyalty. So, given the extreme importance of the nobility, or rather the power and the self-sufficiency of the nobility, the kings were really pretty dependent on the nobles to help them govern their kingdom and to reinforce their power. So in exchange for keeping the loyalty and the obedience of the nobles, the kings would give them land and would give them title. So in theory, the nobles were subservient to the king and were expected to do whatever the king told them or said. In practice, however, the nobles had a lot of power and a lot of influence over the king, which I'll discuss in a little bit. Just some terms to get out of the way, though. So the land that a king or a noble would give to, let me rephrase that. The land that the king would give to a noble was called a fief. So in addition to land, a fief also carried with it a title. In exchange for your fief, you would become a vassal to the person giving you the fief. A vassal was a person who has sworn an oath of loyalty to another. So in exchange for their fiefs, the nobles would have to swear loyalty and become vassals to the king, meaning that if the king needed them, they would be required to serve him. If he needed their soldiers, they would have to let him use their soldiers. If he needed money, they would have to give him money. In theory. In practice, however, the nobles had a lot of self-sufficiency and independence from the king. So because of the manor system, which structured the economy during the medieval period, the nobles didn't really need the king for anything. Everything they would need was made and produced on their own land. They had their own independent source of wealth from the peasants who lived and worked on their land. And they could also just collect taxes and just keep them for themselves instead of sending the tax revenue to the king. The nobles also had their own military. And since the nobles were the ones paying and equipping these soldiers were generally more loyal to their lord than they were to the king, who most of the time they would never even meet. So the nobles, in effect, could avoid having to follow policies implemented by the king that they disagreed with. So even though the king in theory had the most power, in reality, the king's power was effectively limited to only those actions that the nobles would agree to. So for example, the king was effectively kings were effectively never really able to tax the nobility because the nobility could just say no, and the king lacked the resources or the manpower to force them to go along with it. So the independence of the nobility really did serve as a check on the power of the king. So that essentially gives a general overview of how feudalism was structured during this period and how feudalism worked during the Middle Ages. So going forward in this unit, we're going to wrap this unit up by looking at how feudalism ultimately collapsed under the social and political and economic pressures of the Black Death and the 100 Years' War, and a little bit from the Crusades, but it's mostly the Black Death and the 100 Years' War. So hope you guys are doing all right, and I will talk to you later.